Great, thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure, particularly now that I've learned so much more about this institution. I think it's all the more meaningful for me to be able to speak here tonight. The topic is the case for Israel and academic freedom. The reason I'm talking about that is really based on what's happening on campuses. And I talk to a lot of students, I attend a lot of events, and I give a lot of talks on campuses about what's called the boycott, divest, sanction movement. I presume if you're here tonight, you've probably heard about that. There are many different aspects of that movement that are taking place on campuses. I'm only going to address, for the most part, in my prepared comments, the issue of the academic boycott of Israel. I'll explain to you how it came about, what it is, who's behind it, and what the scope of it is. But there are other aspects of the boycott movement, from things as seemingly mundane as trying to kick sabra hummus out of dining halls at colleges, to divesting from companies that do business in Israel, to trying to keep Israeli speakers off campuses, and a lot of different things. And I certainly at the end would welcome questions about any of those things, and would be very willing to engage in a discussion about those things. But they're not the topic of my presentation directly, although I think what I'm going to talk about will make an impact on that. I got interested in the academic boycott because there are academic boycotters out there. And I've been following the boycott movement for many years at my website, but it really came to the forefront a year ago, May, actually, almost around this time, when the first professional academic organization in the United States passed a resolution endorsing the boycott of Israel. And nobody other than me seemed to have paid attention to it. It was the Association for Asian American Studies. Very small group. Literally, I think 140 people voted for the resolution. And people scoffed at it. Well, this is nothing. I mean, who cares about that group? And, I said, well, I think we should care. But nobody really paid attention to it. And then they took that vote, and that really broke the ice. And they went to the American Studies Association, and they said, look, the Association for Asian American Studies has done it, we should do it too. Now, as opposed to a group which was very small, American Studies Association, depending whose numbers you use, has either 4,000 or 5,000 members. Not the biggest by any means, but now a meaningfully sized group. And the boycott movement at the American Studies Association had been planned for years, literally for years, by anti-Israeli academics. But it only sprung up on people's consciousness about a month or two before the vote was going to take place. And by that point in time, they had already taken over key committees. They'd already taken over the National Council. When information was distributed to membership, pro-Israeli academics in that organization found that their material was not being distributed by the central organization. It's kind of a classic example of how organizations get taken over. And so in December, they put it out to a vote of the membership. And of the 3,800 faculty they claimed were eligible, only 1,200 even voted in that election. It was online. And of the 1,200, 800 voted for it and 400 against. So if you do the math, depending how many members they have, something about 20% or so of the membership voted for the resolution. But it was enough to have it passed, because they were the ones who showed up. And one of the reasons I've begun talking to community groups and campuses is, we have to start showing up at these things. And it's who shows up, who wins. So the American Studies Association boycott of Israel, academic boycott of Israel, was passed by 800 people out of a membership of 4,000 or 5,000. But it was a big event, and it got a lot of attention. And that's when I began to get very, very interested, both at my website and personally. And I'll talk about what that boycott means, but what we did is one of the things I've done is I've filed a challenge to their nonprofit status with the IRS on the basis that I think they've now violated the IRS regulations. But it's still there, and it still probably will be there, and they're going to try other groups. When I go to campuses, I'm facing a crowd that's probably more mixed in its views of Israel than this crowd is. And so I have to, one of the approaches I use on campuses, and it's a perfectly valid approach, but it's one that I think works better on campuses, or is more necessary on campuses, is to put forth the thesis that academic boycotts are truly extraordinary events. In the United States, at least, there wasn't even an organized or systematic academic boycott of South Africa. There were economic boycotts. There were universities which divested from companies doing business in South Africa, but there was no systematic nationwide academic boycott, even of South Africa. And so in my view, what you have to do is, if you're going to engage in an academic boycott, and I'll explain why, it has to be the most extreme circumstance. It has to be a circumstance which is so far beyond, to use some college lingo, our shared human experience, that it really puts an entity really outside of humankind. And what I argue on campuses is that you just can't make that case honestly about Israel. That you can make the case that you might not agree with this policy or that policy, just as you don't necessarily agree, depending whether you're Democrat or Republican, you either hated George Bush or you hate Barack Obama's policies. But you know what, that doesn't delegitimize the United States, and certainly is never used as a basis for boycotting US universities. So what you see, though, is the boycotters, and this is true of the ASA and others, they present a completely one-sided view of the Middle Eastern dispute, of the history of the Middle East, and it's a view which I don't think can be sustained. And and that's what I argue, is that once you recognize that there are two sides to the story, then you cannot justify the academic boycott, because it is such an extreme remedy that's used, an extreme process. I also like to tell students, and I'll tell you too, because you're probably feeling the same way. It's not really limited to students. But when I speak to student groups, I tell them the first thing you need to know is that you're not alone. And it's very important, because there aren't a lot of professors on campus who are willing to stand up and be overtly, explicitly, unabashedly pro-Israel. That doesn't mean Israel right or wrong any more than being pro-America means America right or wrong. But it's completely accepting Zionism as a legitimate national rights movement. And I tell them that you live in a bubble on campuses, that the anti-Israeli hostility you're seeing on some US campuses is not indicative of the United States as a whole. Gallup came out in March. It does annual favorability ratings of how Americans perceive foreign nations and foreign entities. And Israel's more popular now in the US than it's ever been. Its favorability rating, according to Gallup, was 72%. Other than Canada, Japan, Britain, really, you can count them on, I think, one hand. Israel had the highest favorability rating. Certainly in the Middle East, by far the highest. By comparison, the Palestinian Authority had a favorability rating of 19%. North Korea, brought up the bottom, had a favorability rating of 4 or 5%, which is actually quite shocking when you think about it. Who are these 4 or 5% of people? But they're out there, a favorable view of North Korea. But by means of comparison, Israel's 72% favorability rating. There was another study, not by Gallup, so the methodology may not have been apples to apples, but I think it's worth mentioning. The favorability rating of kittens in the United States is 71%. So Israel's actually doing better than kittens in the United States. And that's humorous, but I think it's reflective of this disconnect between what's happening on campuses and what's happening in the US as a whole. The US-Israel's popularity is increasing dramatically, whereas on campuses it's a mixed bag. Sky's not falling, you don't have to panic. but you need to take it seriously. Israel is also not as isolated as people make it out to be, including both Israeli and American politicians from time to time. You know, viewing Israel as under siege serves various political purposes, which aren't always obvious. But Israel's exports are up even to the EU, the vaunted EU, which is supposedly going to crack down on Israel. Exports are up. You have a expanding trade relationship with China, dramatically expanding trade relationship with China. The new Indian government just voted in is explicitly pro-Israel. The new Indian Prime Minister was the leader of a region in India which had very greatly expanding trade with Israel. And of course, the US is also obviously still in Israel's camp. So Israel's not as isolated as people think it is. It's obviously one of the few, it's an island of stability for all its problems. Which of its neighbors would you rather live in? I mean, seriously. You know, Jordan's relatively stable, but they're just one king away from being as big a mess as Syria. And so, so why do I even talk about the academic boycott? Why not? You know, a lot of people say, just ignore them. They'll go away. These crazy academics, what do you care what they have to say? Well, because bad things start small, and I think you should address them when they're small. And the academic boycott, in my view, is a bad thing. Before I turn to the specifics, one of the reasons I think perhaps I feel so strong about this is my own personal academic experience. I did graduate from Hamilton College, but actually I did much of my work through Middlebury College through their Russian language program. So in college I was a Soviet studies major specializing in Russian language, and I went to Middlebury College's summer Russian school, and I went with Middlebury College to the Soviet Union. And at a time when we were boycotting the Soviet Olympics in 1980 because they just invaded Afghanistan. And in fact, the Middlebury group I went with, 10 Americans, was on the last Aeroflot flight out of the US heading for Moscow after we had closed down the Soviet consulate in New York and expelled all their diplomats in New York and suspended Aeroflot's flying rights. And we were on that last Aeroflot flight out. You know, 10 American students, 1 professor, about 50 diplomats with families, and a lot of electronic equipment, consumer electronic equipment they were taking back with them because you couldn't buy it in the Soviet Union. But you know, the interesting thing is, I never heard anybody back then talk about academically boycotting the Soviet Union. And think about what the Soviet Union was back then. And that was, I don't know that that was the height of the Cold War, but the Cold War was still there in 1980. The forced collectivization, you know, in the Ukraine killed millions and millions. You know, potentially more people died in that mass famine than died in the Holocaust. That's not taught in schools anymore, or if it ever was taught. The Gulag Archipelago, where people would just disappear. The deportation of entire nationalities. The reason that Crimea is 98% Russian-speaking is because in 1944, Stalin deported the Crimean Tatar nationality en masse to Siberia and Uzbekistan, put them on trains and trucks. The Baltic states, the so-called captive nations, the invasion of Finland. And when I say this, I see some heads shaking up and down, which is really gratifying. Because when I say this to students, it's like, Finland? What is Finland? If they even know what Finland is, that's a plus. And then the Soviet invasion of Finland is news. The Prague Spring. I mean, they've never heard of these things. Lack of academic freedom. You couldn't be a dissident and maintain your academic job in the Soviet Union. You couldn't criticize the government. There was zero academic freedom. Lack of freedom of movement. I mean, you couldn't just decide, well, I don't like living in Moscow anymore. Let's just pick up and move to Leningrad. I mean, it didn't work that way. You have to get approval for that. But throughout all of that, all of the things the Soviet Union really was, nobody called for the academic boycott. At least not that I heard at that time. Just the opposite. We wanted the interaction we were desperate to get that interaction. I think Middlebury, there might have been one other program in Leningrad, we were in Moscow, but we were the only program, and it was we wanted that. We wanted to meet their academics. The Soviets would send to the Middlebury Russian language school for the summer, which is a very intensive language school, several Soviet professors. And we were thrilled to interact with them. We understood the score. They were approved. They, of course, only came over by themselves, not with their family, because to prevent defection. They probably were reporting on us, or maybe not the students, but probably the faculty. We understood all that. But nobody wanted to cut off those relations. And that's why I always felt at that time, we were making a little pinprick in the Soviet Empire by having this academic interaction. It wasn't itself going to bring down the Berlin Wall, or itself going to cause, the Soviet Union to break apart. But it was a really important aspect of spreading liberty and spreading freedom to another place. And so for me, when somebody says, boycott academics, it's so counterintuitive to everything that I grew up with. The second anecdote I'd like to tell you, I'm not personally a big fan of Thomas Friedman, the New York Times writer. But he actually, a couple of months ago, wrote a really good column. And it was a really good column because he just kind of laid out the fact. It wasn't one of these massive opining about whatever that he often does. And it was about a MOOC that was being run from Technion. MOOC is massive online something something. It's the trend in education, I should say, where you have classes conducted online, but in a very sophisticated way where you can actually interact with the professor as opposed to just watching a videotape. It's really the trend. I don't even know what MOOC stands for. But Technion is running, and it's probably run by now, but at the time he was running it, was running a MOOC on nanotechnology. And according to Friedman, I think this is correct, at the time there were 4,800 registrants from throughout the Muslim world for a course offered by an Israeli academic institution, because it was offering something that they couldn't get in their home countries. And the students were from Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Algeria, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, Yemen, United Arab Emirates, and the territories controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Iranians even signed up for it. The professor, it was paid for by Technion. The professor who ran it gave a statement to Friedman that if the Middle East was like the Technion, we would already have peace. In the pure academy, you feel totally equal with every person, and you are appreciated based on your excellence. That professor is an Israeli Arab, a Technion professor. And I learned from that column something that's quite astounding, which is that 19% of Technion's students are Israeli Arabs, or I should say non-Jewish Israelis. And that mirrors almost to the percentage of Israel's population that is not Jewish. Yet, to hear Israel's education system described on campuses, you would think there'd be 0%. You would think that the doors are locked to Israeli Arab students. I also, through my own research, realized that Israeli academic institutions of higher education are 11% Israeli Arab. Doesn't quite mirror the percentage in the country, but if you can go to any elite university within 500 miles of Philadelphia, and you're not going to find many of them that mirror the percentage of African Americans in the United States in their student population. Nobody's using that against them for a boycott. And so those are just two anecdotes. What is academic freedom? Well, it's certainly tenure, it's teaching autonomy. What is it not? It is not freedom from criticism. A lot of tenured academics don't like to be criticized. They consider, well, you're violating my academic freedom because you wrote an op-ed criticizing me. Well, no. That freedom from criticism is not part of academic freedom. I like what the American Association of University Professors, which by the way came out against the academic boycott of Israel. It's probably the premier professional organization, has about 50,000 members, is kind of the keeper of the academic freedom notion in the United States among academics. It says the free exchange of ideas among academics, irrespective of governmental policies and however unpalatable those policies may be viewed. So they try to separate governmental policies from academic freedom and interaction, and specifically come out and say that while any individual professor may have the right to do business or not do business, I mean, just because you're against an academic boycott doesn't mean that every single individual professor at every university must interact with Israeli universities. But the AAUP says that when such non-cooperation takes the form of a systematic academic boycott, it threatens the principles of free expression and communication. And that's really the key thing, that academic freedom is the free exchange of ideas and free interaction among academics, irrespective of government policies. And that means interacting with Soviet academics at the time, even if you didn't like their government's policies. And that works vice versa, by the way. You know, you could imagine Soviet academics saying, well, we're going to boycott American universities because we don't like what they're doing in Vietnam. So it works both ways. And because of the AAUP's position, and because people have always recognized that academic boycotts are different. I mean, if you don't want to eat sabra hummus, don't eat sabra hummus. I'm against a boycott of it for political reasons, but it's a very different character than an academic boycott. The history of boycotts with regard to Israel is very clear what the source of it is. The boycotts against Jews in British Mandate of Palestine began no later than the early 1920s. I mean, I've seen articles about the Arab boycott of Jewish businesses in Palestine in the early 1920s, decades before there was a state of Israel. It was a boycott of Jews. The Arab League was formed in 1944, and in 1945 started its boycott of Jewish businesses in Palestine. Again, Israel wasn't even a country yet. So if you look at the history of the boycotts in the Middle East, it's a boycotts directed at Jews, specifically. But the modern and then of course you had the Arab League boycott, which extended through the oil embargo period in the 1970s, and that US passed legislation which didn't quite do away with it, but seriously constrained it, and that was very important. But the modern boycott movement, what we call BDS, was a formulation at the 2001 Durban conference, conference put on by the UN and non-governmental university entities, I should say, organizations. And that conference was so blatantly anti-Semitic that the US actually walked out on it. And former late Congressman Tom Lantos attended that, as did some other people, and he wrote about that. And I'm going to try not to read you too many quotes, but I do want to read you this, because this is where the boycott movement was born, the modern boycott movement. It was at the NGO, non-governmental organization, forum at the Durban conference. Each day, Congressman Lantos writes, these groups organized anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic rallies around the meetings, attracting thousands. One flyer, which was widely distributed, showed a photograph of Hitler and the question, what if I had won? The answer, there would be no Israel. At a press conference held by Jewish NGOs to discuss their concerns with the direction the conference was taking, an accredited NGO, the Arab Lawyers Union, distributed a booklet filled with anti-Semitic caricatures frighteningly like those seen in the Nazi hate literature printed in the 1930s. Jewish leaders and I who were in Durban were shocked at this blatant display of anti-Semitism. For me, having experienced the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand, this was the most sickening and unabashed display of hate for Jews I had seen since the Nazi period. Sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, the official NGO document that was later adopted by a majority of the 3,000 NGOs in the forum branded Israel a, quote, racist apartheid state, close quote, guilty of genocide, and called for an end to its racist crimes against the Palestinians. The document itself is the template for the BDS movement. The document that was issued at that forum calls for a launch of an international anti-Israeli apartheid movement as implemented against South Africa, calls upon the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state, and it called for the formulation of a global solidarity campaign of international civil society. The final declaration of the boycott was issued in 2005. It took them 2 or 3 years. There had been interim formulations of that boycott. It's formed as a boycott from Palestinian civil society, not because Palestinian civil society decided, well, let's just get together and do this. That was the procedure laid out at the Durban conference that they would use. And they appealed to the world for a complete cultural and academic boycott of Israel. And that is the boycott call, the 2005 boycott call from quote-unquote Palestinian civil society under the formula developed at the Durban conference, is the boycott call the American Studies Association has agreed to abide by. There is a direct line from the anti-Semitic Durban conference to the boycott call to what the American Studies Association has agreed to abide by. That's not something they like to talk about. They may even be ignorant of it, or at least some of them. In 2005, guidelines were issued for the academic boycott by the Palestinian Campaign for the Cultural and Academic Boycott of Israel, which later opened a US branch run by a professor, or formed by a professor in the University of California system. The US Campaign for the Cultural and Academic Boycott of Israel. The academic boycott guidelines, and I'll read you some of them. One of the general guidelines is that they are to refrain from participation in any form of academic and cultural cooperation, collaboration, or joint projects with Israeli institutions. The specific things that they bar are participation with Israelis at academic events, such as conferences, symposia, workshops, book and museum exhibits, convened or co-sponsored by Israeli institutions. They bar participation in international cooperation agreements with Israeli universities, which typically involve exchange of faculty and students and conduct of joint research, so no joint research. They bar participation in study abroad programs in Israel. They bar addresses or talks at international venues by official representatives of Israeli academic institutions, such as presidents and rectors. They bar Palestinian, Arab, and Israeli collaborative research projects. And their reasoning is that it's widely, and I'm reading this, it's widely known that the easiest route to securing a research grant for a Palestinian academic is to apply with an Israeli partner. So they're willing to punish Palestinian academics and deprive them of the opportunity to get research funding in order to boycott Israel. They are bar researchers and projects based at American or other universities. They bar international membership of Israeli associations and world bodies. And what to me is the most chilling of them all is they bar publishing in or refereeing articles for academic journals based at Israeli universities. So you cannot even participate in the production of academic journals at Israel. And that is what the American Studies Association agreed to. When that was moving towards a vote, even the anti-Israeli participants at the ASA began to get very nervous about this. And I was tracking this at the time. Because what I've just read you, I mean, that's pretty awful. I mean, think about it. It's nothing that's ever been done to any other country in any sort of systematic way, ever, in the history, at least the modern history, recorded history of the world, at least not in the US. And so they purported to scale them back. And they said, well, they didn't say we don't accept them. They issued what they literally called talking points for their members, because they knew this was going to create a firestorm on campus. So they issued talking points They also issued questions and frequently asked questions about it. And what they basically said is, well, we don't boycott individuals, because that's what everybody in their organization began to get very nervous about. You're telling me I can't pick up the phone and talk to an Israeli academic? They said, no, that's not, we don't boycott. And that's the only way in which they have purported to scale it back. But the interesting thing is, it's a ludicrous concept. If you are completely boycotting everything regarding an Israeli university, down to refereeing articles, peer review. You're not going to participate in peer review for their articles. You're not going to participate in conferences with them. You're not going to allow them to appear at conferences. You're going to do all these. Of course you're boycotting individuals. I mean, if we were to organize a boycott of the University of Pennsylvania under these guidelines, is there anybody who would say we're not boycotting the individuals who make up that university? The students, the faculty? But that was enough of a fig leaf for them to say, okay, well, it's really not that bad. We don't boycott individuals. But in fact, it actually does affect individuals, and they have retained, even in their questions and answer, the boycott of anyone appearing as a representative of an Israeli academic institution. So a test is applied to Israeli academics that does not get applied to academics from any other country in the world, which is that you can participate, but you cannot do it on behalf of your university. You can show up here from Damascus University, and you can be a representative of Damascus University, and that's okay with the American Studies Association. But you can't show up here on behalf of Technion and participate. And so they do actually explicitly boycott individuals, and they implicitly boycott them as well. What is required for the ASA's academic boycott to end? When does it end? Well, their question and answer, their frequently asked question, says, this is a difficult question to answer. And basically it never ends. They say, well, we will defer to the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel on that question. So they have no end to it. There is no measurement by which this ends. It's in perpetuity, or until somebody declared, other than the ASA, declares it to be over. So whose academic freedom is impacted by this? Again, a lot of people say, ASA. Nobody even heard of them. In fact, I contacted one of the presidents, I'm trying to remember, Willamette University. And it's not a secret, I published it on the website. And what's your position on the academic boycott of Israel just passed by the ASA? And his response was, until you wrote me, I'd never even heard of the ASA. And he's the president of a university. And so people say, well, there's no impact, it's purely symbolic. But it's only purely symbolic right now because it hasn't spread. And they're trying to move it up the food chain. They're trying to move it to larger academic organizations. If they had their way, not only would professional organizations be boycotting Israeli academic institutions, so would US academic institutions. So the fact that it hasn't metastasized into something truly damaging doesn't mean that it's not a malignant sort of ideology. Obviously it affects Israelis. If they had their way, who would it affect? Well, obviously the Israelis, because they couldn't participate in conferences unless they disavowed representation of their program. They couldn't host international programs. They couldn't do all the things I just mentioned. Obviously, it affects US universities and scholars, because if they had their way, you wouldn't be able to do all of the things and interact with Israelis as I've just indicated. If they had their way, it would affect the general academic community, including advances in medical and other sciences. And it also would affect students, because this is the faculty deciding what the university and their would do, and students would be bound by that. I mean, if your university is not going to have a program in Israel, you as a student can't go on it because it won't exist. If you're not going to have joint research with Israeli academic institutions, you as a student can't participate in that research because it won't exist. And so it affects students also. And so one of the messages I send students is that your professors have no right to determine what you read, what you write, and who you interact with. It's a usurpation of your educational freedom for their political reasons, and that they have no right to do that. Moreover, the sheer hypocrisy of it. If you were to apply their reasoning, they should be boycotting U.S. universities. There practically isn't a U.S. university that doesn't sit on what were once Native American lands. The U.S. is a colonial power of Europeans who came here and colonized the New World, or to them was the New World. The U.S. has invaded other countries. We had slavery here. We had segregation here. We have racism in various forms still, although it's obviously not what it once was. So if you apply the standards that they apply to Israel, you should be boycotting U.S. universities. And so I've made public calls. I call on the ASA academics to boycott U.S. universities, to apply the same standard to the U.S. and to every other country that you apply to Israel. And if you're going to single out Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, for a different standard than is applied to everybody else, then you have some explaining to do. In fact, there were 39 professors at Vassar College who signed a letter defending the academic boycott of Israel. And I challenged them to a debate. You won't be surprised that none of them accepted the debate challenge. In their letter defending the ASA's boycott, they said, and some of us, if asked to do so, would boycott U.S. universities for intellectual consistency. And so I posed the question when I spoke at Vassar. I said, have any of them resigned yet? Of course not. And so what's the excuse they give when they say, why is Israel singled out? Of all the problem countries in the world, you're not going to boycott Syria. You're not going to boycott Saudi Arabia, where Islamic law is in effect. And there is explicit discrimination against people who are not Muslim. And that's in many Muslim countries, not all, but in many of them. If you are not going to boycott China, it occupies Tibet. If you're not going to boycott Turkey, because it suppresses Kurdish national aspirations and occupies the northern part of Cyprus. If you're not going to boycott Morocco, because it boycotts part of Sahara that was not Moroccan, is not internationally recognized. I mean, if you're going to do all these things, how do you justify Israel of all the countries in the world? Why Israel? And the responses you get are varied. And one of them is, as they've indicated, well, because we were asked to. No entity has asked us to boycott any other country. It's only Israel. I mean, think about that. Is that really a justification that somebody asked you to do it? Well, Your Honor, I shot him because somebody asked me to do it. Okay, that's just not a defense. And they don't, there's a reason nobody else has asked for this. Because it's so abhorrent. It's so destructive. The fact that at the Durban conference, the anti-Semitic Durban conference, they came up with this as a strategy to be applied to Israel. And then they deliberately structured it as a request from Palestinian civil society. I mean, it didn't just happen. That's how they structured it. It was what we like to call astroturfed. Okay? That's not a justification. They say, well, we have a special obligation because Israel's the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. And that's true. Israel receives when I checked the numbers, I think it was about $3 billion in military aid. It's almost entirely, I think there's a 30 million joint humanitarian project, but it's basically 100% military aid. Israel doesn't receive economic aid, unlike many other countries. And that's true. The not so secret of military aid that the U.S. gives is that it's essentially a subsidy for the U.S. defense industry. And that's okay, because we give military aid. Most of it has to be used to purchase weapons made by U.S. manufacturers, so it keeps the production lines running, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, Israel is the largest recipient. We also give a lot to Egypt. I don't think we give that much to Turkey anymore, but there were time periods when we did. But you know what? We also give a lot of aid to the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority receives about, as of 2012, about $450 million a year from the U.S. That's not $3 billion, but their population is much smaller. We're basically talking about the West Bank. We're not even talking about Gaza, because that's run by Hamas. So if you do the apples to apples, the per capita, Israel receives about twice as much aid as the Palestinians do, but it's not as lopsided as people think. They say, well, Israel suppresses Palestinian education. Well, I've just told you about Technion, and I've told you about how 11% of the Israeli academic higher educational system is Israeli Arab, and it's growing. They just passed I think it was 300 or 400 million shekel allotment to try to expand that. And there's a lot of reasons why, not necessarily explicit discrimination, why the participation is lower. But look what's happened in the West Bank and Gaza since Israel's not in control of Gaza anymore, but during the period it was, and the West Bank. In 1967, there were 0 universities in the West Bank and Gaza. Today, there are over 20. It is true that there are security issues that necessitate roadblocks and other things. But the fact of the matter is you have thriving Palestinian universities, which are hotbeds of anti-Israeli agitation throughout the West Bank and in Gaza. So while it may not be a perfect situation, it's actually much better than it was under Jordanian control. Then they get into the Israeli as an apartheid state. That, well, Israel is unique. It has to be singled out because it's this apartheid state. But unfortunately, and including by some of our own politicians and even some Israeli politicians, apartheid has taken on a more generic, looser definition than it actually meant in South Africa. In South Africa, it was a racial domination by a minority over a majority based on racial classifications, and in a very systematic way. And the reason why apartheid is considered now, by international treaty, a crime against humanity, it's because it was qualitatively different than mere discrimination. It was much like the Holocaust was different than other mass murders, other genocidal mass murders, because of how institutionalized and industrialized it was. I mean, it was qualitatively different. And so to apartheid was qualitatively different than the sort of discrimination that unfortunately takes place in many countries around the world, and in many different racial directions, not just white on black, So the international, the Rome Statute sets forth what the crime of apartheid is, what the crime against humanity. There are several types, including genocide, but they have one that's called apartheid. And the crime of apartheid means committing certain sort of actions, and they list the actions, to institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups. So it's a very race-based definition. That is what it was in South Africa. It wasn't mere, and I say mere in quotation marks, wasn't mere ethnic disputes, which take place everywhere in the world. One group doesn't like another group, they fight with each other. Wasn't mere religious conflict, religious domination. Because if that were the standard, then every country where Islamic law prevails under that loose definition would have to be deemed an apartheid state. It doesn't mean mere separation of peoples, which is the newfangled definition people try to use, because, I mean, think about the history of nations is the history of people separating. Italy for Italians, France for the French. I mean, if separation of peoples is apartheid, then it's practiced throughout the world. But that's not what apartheid was. And so people have changed that. It's not mere domination of territory that's in dispute. Otherwise, China would be an apartheid state for dominating Tibet. The Russians now in Ukraine. Whatever you think about the Russians grabbing Crimea and potentially more of Ukraine, it's not apartheid. I mean, it may be other things, but it's not apartheid. Israel's majority rule. I mean, that's the key distinction between South Africa and Israel. Israel's majority rule. South Africa was minority rule. And that's a very important distinction. In Israel, it's one person, one vote, and the majority rules. Israel itself, the Jewish community there, is multiracial. Half of the Israeli population either are refugees from, or the descendants of refugees from Arab nations. The refugee problem that no one talks about, because Israel absorbed an equivalent number of Jewish refugees from Arab countries as Arab countries never absorbed of refugees from the 48 war. Israel's gone to great lengths to rescue non-European and non-white communities. Think of the Ethiopians. May not be a perfect integration into Israeli society. That's something they're going to struggle with. So does every country in the world. But to say Israel's an apartheid state went to great lengths to rescue, a black African Jewish population just tells you how crazy this has become. The other excuses you'll hear are, well, Israel's apartheid wall. And so Students for Justice in Palestine will build these mock walls and mock checkpoints to demonstrate how evil Israel is. But you will never hear them discuss why the wall was built. And it's mostly a fence. It's a wall only in some heavily populated areas. It's mostly a fence. It's because when Yasser Arafat walked away from Camp David, he started the Second Intifada. And in 2002, 457 Israelis, civilians, died in suicide bombing attacks. That's when they started constructing the barrier. And if you look at the history of the deaths of Israelis from suicide bombings, each year, as more and more of it was built, it cut in half, cut in half, cut in half, and now it's close to nil. And so yes, we would, if Israel just wanted to build that barrier for the sake of making life miserable for the Palestinians, for the sake of dominating them, for the sake of grabbing land, why didn't they do it much earlier? Why did they wait till the suicide bombing campaign? Because that's why it was built. You'll never see it a mock Israeli apartheid wall. You'll never see mock suicide bombers. You'll never hear the American Studies Association once in all of the literature that they've published about the justification and how the barrier creates problems for Palestinian students. You will not read a single word about why that was built. It's almost like it just happened. You'll never hear anything about how, even to this day, people at checkpoints, and the number of checkpoints has dramatically been scaled back. But even today, they find sophisticated weapons at those checkpoints. I remember reading, right before I was giving a speech at another campus, just that week, a very sophisticated German anti-tank weapon was confiscated at one of those checkpoints. And that happens all the time. So you'll never hear any of that reasoning. You'll hear, well, Israel's, quote, occupation of the West Bank, close quote, is illegal under international law, as if that's a given. Well, actually, either the history of the West Bank or the international law with regard to it. The League of Nations in 1922 established the British Mandate in Palestine explicitly as a homeland for the Jewish people. You can like that or you cannot like it, but it was the international law. And that international law has never been revoked. And that was the international law when the UN was created. The UN essentially absorbed all of the body of law that the League of Nations had approved. And what happened was, during the War of Independence, Jordan illegally seized land that had, under international law, been designated as part of the Jewish homeland. Only 2 countries in the world recognized that Jordanian occupation of the West Bank, Britain and Pakistan. So it was not accepted internationally. So when Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967, it was taking land which under international law had been designated as the Jewish homeland from an illegally occupying entity named Jordan. People don't understand that. And what does that mean for international law today? Because international law, not like the US where we have the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides and it's binding everywhere. International law is a little fuzzier sort of concept and changes over time. And so there are legitimate disputes, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you to an absolute certainty that Israel's control of the West Bank is absolutely legal under international law. But what I can tell you is anyone who comes in here and says the opposite, that there's no question, absolutely, it is illegal, is wrong. There are legitimate scholarly disputes, and that's why U.S. administration can never quite seem to get its story straight how it refers to that territory, but for a while we were referring to it, I think correctly, as disputed territory. There are disputes as to under international law, because there aren't many places where you have an entity reclaiming illegally occupied territory, and that reclaiming of that territory is not accepted by the international community. Israel might be unique in that regard. So for example, if Ukraine were to recapture Crimea 17 years from now, would people scream that that's an illegal occupation of Crimea by Ukraine when the territory was illegally taken from it? So the fact that Jordan illegally occupied the West Bank for 20 years, not even 20 years, 19 years, that means Israel's reclaiming of that is, I think there's a legitimate dispute there. But they will shout, illegal occupation, and they'll just repeat it ad infinitum. One interesting thing I only recently learned was that the original Palestinian National Charter of 1964, which is hard to find online, but somebody helped me find it, actually from Palestinian consulate in New York. They had it online, but it wasn't easy to find, because everybody has the copy of the 1968 version, which declares a unified whole to Palestine, and that seeks the liberation of all of the British Mandate of Palestine, including Israel proper and the West Bank. The 1964 original Palestinian National Charter disavowed any territorial claim to the West Bank. Specifically, Article 24, this organization does not exercise any territorial sovereignty over the West Bank in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, on the Gaza Strip, which of course was occupied by Egypt at the time, or in the Hima area, which is essentially what we now call Jordan. So this great illegal occupation as to territory was Israel reclaiming territory which under international law was to be part of the Jewish homeland, was illegally occupied by Jordan, and as to which the Palestinian National Charter had disavowed any territorial claim. Knowing that history, I think you'll read the newspapers a little different when you keep hearing them refer to the illegal occupation. And again, I'm not saying there's not a good faith argument that it's, quote, illegal under international law, but it's not a slam dunk by any means. So there's a legitimate, I think reasonable people can differ on that. And so what you see is a number of things which are just thrown out there, and I've only touched on a few of them because I really want to leave time for questions and dialogue, which are just disputed, but they are verbalized by the American Studies Association, by the 39 faculty members at Vassar, by professors, as if they're just given truths, and they're not. And so the point I make is that there are two sides to the coin. There are two sides to the story. The Israeli side is not necessarily absolutely correct. There is a Palestinian side to the story. In that circumstance, where there are two sides to the story, an academic boycott is particularly inappropriate. And if you want to, the good news is that virtually the entire academic community agrees with me. As of now, over 250 university presidents have come out rejecting the ASA boycott. The American Council on Education, which represents virtually every higher educational institution, maybe even Gratz College in the US. The American Association of University Professors has come out against it. The Association of American Universities has come out against it. And they're smart to do that, because what do you hear the ASA screaming about now? They're screaming about alleged infringement of their academic freedom by legislation that's pending, or by pressure on them from university officials. Well, I'm sorry. If you are the one to take away other people's academic freedom, you lose the moral authority to complain when somebody wants to do it to you. And so the university presidents were really the adults in the room. They understand that academic boycotts are very easy to start, but they're not so easy to stop. I mean, why shouldn't we be boycotting any number of US universities? Why shouldn't we be boycotting specific classes we don't like? Which is what Students for Justice in Palestine tried to do to a course that was going to Israel. Part of the class to study water ecosystems involved travel to Israel and the West Bank. Students for Justice in Palestine picketed the class and tried to get students to drop the class because it involved travel to Israel. And is that what we really want to happen on our campuses? Because that works both ways, by the way. It doesn't just work against Israeli professors, because there'll come a point in time where people say, we're going to do it to you too. And when I say that, things start small and can end badly, I'll end just with one other anecdote, which is Vassar, which has really gone off the charts. And I spoke there. And Students for Justice in Palestine became so unhinged after my speech there that not only did they start attacking on their multiple social media platforms the race of the crowd and the age of the crowd. Too many old white people on our campus in that room, which is hideous enough. They then started citing anti-Zionist propaganda from white supremacist websites. And when a professor I know at Ithaca College, who heads their Jewish Studies program, saw that, called them out on it. And they defended it. Said, well, just because it comes from white supremacists doesn't mean it's wrong. And that's, I guess, literally true. I mean, every argument gets judged on its merits. And then, remember I told you what they did at the Durban conference? How they passed around these hideous caricatures of Jews. Then they published an actual Nazi, not neo-Nazi, actual Nazi cartoon. Anti-Jewish, anti-American cartoon from the Nazi era. I can't really describe it to you, it's kind of hard to describe, but a very prominent, a hideous kind of figure stomping all over territory with its legs were bombs and had a big Jewish star on it. And literally they published a Nazi cartoon. And so you wonder, where does this thing lead? And that's why I say it's got to be fought right now. Finally, the president of Vassar spoke out against that, but only after a lot of horrendous things had happened on campus. And that's where this thing leads. I'm sorry, that's where it leads. It doesn't lead there tomorrow, but there is a shared space in this world between anti-Israel Zionists of the racist type and anti-Israel Zionists of the far left type and anti-Israel Zionists of the Students for Justice in Palestine type, and obviously of the Islamist type also. And that's why I think it's got to be fought, and that's why I've devoted so much time to fighting it. The good news is that, again, the sky is not falling. I think there will be more moves to get professional organizations to sign on to the boycott. We'll see if they'll be successful. There are no universities that I'm aware of that are considering it. So, the professional organizations, they can take over. They can't take over a university. So, with that, I will end, and I would really love to hear your questions.
I would like to form of guarantees, loan guarantees, that by and large, which the money has to be spent in the United States and provide over 50,000 American jobs. That is never reported.
Is there any American corporations, or is there funding? Is funding going from Americans to this region?
I'm going to just repeat the questions as they're asked, just so that people can hear them if they didn't. The question was whether there's funding, who's funding these groups, essentially, is the question. And that's a very good question, and we don't have the answer to it. They certainly have plenty of money to fly people around. They have plenty of money to employ organizers. They're very coordinated. We don't really know the source of funding. We do know that on many campuses, the source of funding is the university itself, because Students for Justice in Palestine gets accredited as a student group. They're therefore entitled to student funding like any other student group, and they use that funding to bring speakers. So a lot of the funding actually comes from US universities for Students for Justice in Palestine. But who's coordinating it at a higher level is hard to know. We do know there's a great group in Israel called NGO Monitor, run by a professor there, which tracks non-governmental organization funding. A lot of it comes from EU countries, that they will give funding to groups which purport to be human rights groups, etc. Those groups will then fund other groups, which fund other groups, so the money trickles down, and it eventually makes its way to NGOs in Israel, whose sole job, every morning they wake up and their job is to find something wrong with Israel and to publicize it. I mean, Israel is under a microscope like no other country in the world. And I believe, although I can't prove it, I believe that that is the same cycle that funds the BDS movement, that no European country is cutting a check to the BDS movement, but it cuts a check to some foundation, which cuts a check to some other group, which then engages in boycott activities.
I want to reinforce something that you said at the beginning of your talk. At the beginning of the year, my wife and I were in London, where we had the good fortune to be provided by our hotel with the Financial Times. The Financial Times, on the top of the split page, had a big article on Israel and China and India, showing a photograph of Netanyahu and the president of China with their hands reaching for each other, and the silliest grins I've ever seen, like, we put something over on everybody. The reporter talked about the three things that China most wanted from Israel: technology, technology, and technology. And being on the side of China and India and some other countries, you know, I really can't be too worried about American academics. What they do, they're crazy.
Well, but the problem is that so the point is, I don't know if everybody heard that, essentially, given Israel's expanding relations with India and China and with the US, why essentially should we be worried about these crazy academics? And it's because if you see what has happened, those are where the theories get developed, which then develop into broader boycott movements. I mean, if you look at what the boycott movement is in Europe, it's still not a strategic threat to Israel, but it's a much bigger threat than it is in the US. And so I don't view the academic boycott in the US in the short term as a real threat. On the other hand, I'd like to keep it that way. And I'd like to not have it grow into more of a threat.
Please stand up. Can you have them stand?
He'll read that. On an academic level, but aren't we just putting our finger in the dike when we fail to observe the source of anti-Semitism that poisons the minds of every new generation?
Well, that's
about the New Testament, right?
Well, that's beyond my purview. You know, I think that the fact of the matter is that if you look at the landscape, at least in the US and to some extent in Europe, if you look at the landscape and you want to draw a dividing line between anti-Israel, pro-Israel, the Christian community in the US is among the most supportive community. As a whole, not to say the Presbyterian Church, there are specific examples, but as a whole, the evangelical community and others are extremely supportive of Israel. So I don't think personally you can draw those sort of conclusions in terms of the modern boycott movement. The history of anti-Semitism is what it is. I can't change that. But there's also a lot of Islamic anti-Semitism that's behind a lot of this stuff. So I don't think you can blame the New Testament.
Just a view from 40,000 feet or so. The Danish cartoons that were only published by the Inquirer, but it was Yale University Press that did a scholastic study of them that did not publish the cartoons. And just, if you would comment as an academic, from an academic perspective, to me there's a corollary in the thinking between what's behind the BDS movement and that sort of nonsense, really, that would pass as scholastic research at Yale University Press.
I didn't read that article, so I can't comment on that. But I think,
It was a book.
there's no question that there's a double standard, not just in campuses, but in society as a whole. You can criticize Christianity in the most crude terms, and you'll get a comedy gig on HBO. There's a lesser tolerance for that sort of criticism of Judaism, and there is almost zero tolerance for that sort of criticism of Islam. And it's because of the threat of violence and other things, and what some organizations have done to brand, what, if it were applied to Christianity, it would be deemed very mild criticism. But if it's directed at Islam, you'll be termed Islamophobic, and that shuts down the conversation. So to me, I can't speak to that specific study, but the fact that, somebody whose life would be threatened for publishing a cartoon of Muhammad, but art institutes in New York will have these horrific displays of Jesus, in urine, I think is a double standard. I think there's got to be freedom of speech for everybody.
My name is David, and I work for the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. I just want to thank you for coming back tonight, and thank you for all of your work. As members of the community, what other organizations do you work with that make the case for academic freedom to support Israel and Israel-related issues on campus?
I don't really work directly with organizations, although I did just agree to become a campus faculty something or other for some group. But I don't personally work with other groups, but there are other groups doing very good work. In terms of fighting the divestment movement on campus, there's Stand With Us has done very good work from what I've seen. There's the Organization of America. But what I see actually on the ground on campuses is Stand With Us, AMCA initiative. There's Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, which writes a lot of good material. I'm not formally affiliated with any of these groups, but there are a lot of groups out there. I think what's happened in the last year has been a huge wake-up call for the Jewish community, and I think they realize that they can't do what they've been doing the last 30 years, which is abandoning the campuses, and they've got to get re-involved.
What would be considered prosecutable hate speech?
Well, I hope actually nothing is prosecutable hate speech. I'm from the old-fashioned school, which is that speech you don't like, you counter with more speech. In the U.S. at least, I hope we don't have hate speech laws. We do have laws, which add criminality to conduct which is otherwise criminal. But there might be civil remedies, discrimination, etc. But I don't think we criminalize speech in the U.S.
I also would like to ask you about, wasn't there a British journalist a number of years ago who's written several books who instigated a, pardon me? No, not that. Yes, Galloway. She was a British journalist and she instituted a file against a European hate speaker.
Yeah, well,
And she won.
Europe has a different concept of freedom of speech than we do. So they don't have our First Amendment.
NASDAQ or something, what's her name?
Holocaust is not.
Right, right, thank you. Thank you.
What is your position on the role that alumni groups can play with respect to universities in terms of even holding back with contributions? I know last year when the BDS issue came up at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a tremendous hue and cry by the alumni, and very shortly after, a lot of edicts came out of Amy Gutton's office.
I think alumni play a critical role because you have to understand what's happened on campuses. Not every campus, but kind of many of the higher profile campuses, like UPenn and other places, that there is very little pro-Israel support among faculty. They may be quiet, they may be pro-Israel, but they're not vocal about it. And students really feel abandoned on campus to a large degree. And I think alumni can fill a very important role of being a voice, because you don't get graded by these professors. You don't have to live in fear of them, whereas the students do. And students are very afraid. Students have told me they're very afraid when they're sitting in class and the professor is bashing Israel, or when they're asked to write a term paper to take a pro-Israel side because they're fearful of the grade. And one bad grade can ruin your chance of getting into medical school. One C on the transcript, and students are very aware of it. And a lot of these faculty are bullies. And so it takes people who can't be bullied by them to stand up for the students on campus. And I think alumni and parents are absolutely critical at helping to fill that. And I would suggest to people that, instead of withholding, or in addition to, I should say, in addition to withholding contributions to the university, you should use what you would have contributed to fund pro-Israel activities on campus. Because what you have to do, you have to realize that on many campuses, and Hillel has filled this void for many years very well, to provide an alternative educational experience on campus, because they will not get a fair presentation in their classes. And Hillel performed the role through bringing speakers and bringing other people of providing that alternative. So I would suggest, not only if you feel very strongly that the university is not responsive and that the administration is not responsive, in addition to withholding it, take that money and donate it to Hillel for specific use on that campus for a specific purpose, or something else like that. I think that's a better alternative, because that's not just a negative, that's also a positive. And so I think that's really, really important. Vassar, as a result of the craziness at Vassar, has a very active, newly formed, they call it Fairness to Israel group, which helped bring me to campus, because the multiple departments at Vassar, the week before I got there, sponsored a talk by two of the most aggressive anti-Israel speakers in the U.S., Max Blumenthal and Ali Abunimah from the Electronic Intifada. They paid for those people to go there. I don't know if they paid them directly, but I do know for a fact that university funds were used for the sponsorship. It was sponsored by multiple academic departments, including the Jewish Studies Department. When my sponsor, not Fairness to Israel, the student group, asked those academic units to sponsor me, they refused. And you know who was the head? And this is how crazy it is on campus. And it also shows you how you can't stereotype people. The head of the Vassar Conservative Libertarian Union is a conservative, politically conservative American Muslim who is pro-Israel. And he was the only one willing to invite me to give a pro-Israel speech on campus. Hillel's out of the question because it's now an open Hillel. Okay, the student head of the Jewish Student Union at Vassar is anti-Zionist.
I want to thank you for your wonderful presentation and in explaining the history of the BDS movement and taking it back to Durban 1. I just remembered that Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, was the major organizer of Durban 1. And as a reward for her excellent work, she was recognized by President Obama with the highest American medal of civilian medal of recognition for fine public work. So,
in fairness to Mary Robinson, she did one good thing.
what was that?
That at the Durban conference, she gave a press conference. And she held up the book of anti-Semitic cartoons that were being passed around. And she said, "Today I am a Jew too."
Oh, well.
That doesn't relieve her of all the other negative things she's done. But that's how bad the Durban conference was. That even a woman who is widely regarded as being hostile to Israel, it was so bad that even she got up and felt the need to make a public statement.
I think that what you said is correct about most Americans give Israel high marks. And I believe that, as you said, the Muslim people, if you say something against them, then they stand as a group. The black Muslim Americans, they stand as a fact. I think our problem is, how do we get the Jewish people to stand also as what can you do to light that fire? Everyone in this room is here to listen to you, but to a lot of this room, I'm concerned.
Well, a couple of responses to that. One, I don't know that you can categorize the other groups as standing as some monolithic group. And I think my experience at Vassar is a very good example of that. Maybe not the loudest voices, okay, but there are voices out there, and obviously in the black community as well. One of the most prominent young pro-Zionist college students in the U.S. is a black woman from Louisiana. She may not be from Louisiana, but she goes to Tulane, I believe it is, Chloe Valderi. So I don't think, I don't think you can categorize groups. How do you keep Jews united? If I had the answer to that. But it is definitely true that what you have seen, adding to the normal historical Jewish divisiveness, you have a very calculated and savvy campaign to tear apart Jewish unity when it comes to Israel through the Open Hillel movement. I'm not generally, I haven't gotten into the fight about, and this will be the last answer, I haven't gotten into the whole fight about J Street and all that sort of thing, but I can tell you that the week before I spoke at Vassar, so between the Blumenthal-Abinima speech and mine, the newly formed J Street group at Vassar invited 3 anti-Israeli speakers to campus, including one from Jewish Voice for Peace, which is one of the most damaging groups to our cause on campus, because they're always the front people. They're always the people, well, this can't be anything but what it, this is just a political dispute, because look, here are Jews who agree with us. But I think there are very calculated attempts going on to deliberately divide us and to destroy a place like Hillel on campus. And I feel pretty strongly about the Open Hillel, that absolutely Jewish youth, pro-Israel youth on campus should be exposed to alternative views. They should not be hermetically sealed in some sort of cocoon or anything like that. But with all these other anti-Israeli groups on campus, why are you singling out the one that's pro-Israel and insisting that it turn over its building to anti-Israel groups, when you don't insist on that for any other group? I've yet to hear an open SJP movement, open Students for Justice in Palestine, that at their meetings and their events, they must have pro-Zionist speakers. And you don't hear that. Why is it that the only group on campus, and I can tell you, at Vassar, a lot of the Jewish students feel very isolated, because the one place on campus, certainly not their classrooms, okay, certainly not their dormitories, certainly not the student center, okay, they put up the apartheid wall, and the student I mentioned to you, the politically conservative Muslim student on campus, put up the wall of truth from David Horowitz's Freedom Center to counter these things. It was defaced, and it was taken down by the Vassar administration on the grounds that they didn't have a proper permit. Okay. Yeah, I'd rather go a little longer now.
Let's take two more questions then.
I would just like to mention about J Street, they're getting very big on the college campuses.
Right. And I can tell you at Cornell, J Street has had a very positive, that's why I don't like to generalize. Because at Cornell, they've had a very positive influence. They stood side by side with Hillel and with CPAC, which is Cornell Israeli Public Affairs, whatever. It's the Cornell version of AIPAC. So they all stood united against the divestment movement on Israel. But I've seen at other campuses like Vassar, where it's been the opposite. They will present a 2-hour program bashing Israel. And at the end they say, but we do want Israel to exist. And I have a problem with that, because once you give up the argument and you do single Israel out as uniquely evil, it's very easy. So I'm not going to generalize about J Street. I've seen troubling things on campus, but I want to get a broader view before I come to a conclusion. Okay, one last.
I'd like to know, everybody's aware that J Street is sponsored by Soros.
Is there any, have you seen any connection between the politically correct movement and the anti-Israeli movement on campus?
The question is political correctness and the anti-Israel movement. One thing that I have seen, and this is what I saw at Harvard in the early 1980s, is an attempt to racialize the dispute, to portray it as people of color versus white Europeans, as anti-colonialists versus colonialists, and that is a very active movement and tactic. It's taking place on campuses right now, where groups which should have perfect affinity with Jewish student groups have been targeted by SJP and others and turned against Israel with arguments such as the separation barrier, which they call the apartheid wall, is the same problem that Mexican Americans face with fencing along the US-Mexican border. And they try to draw that parallel and try to say that it's essentially the same problem, the same racist problem, and they try to turn it into a very racialized sort of analysis with modest success. So if that's what you meant by political correctness, that is happening on campuses. It's a deliberate strategy, and it's been going on for 30 years. It just seems to have been ramped up. And I think that will be the last question.
Thank you very much for a very informative discussion, and I know it's